flow like consensus.
There we go. Recording in progress. Okay. All right. So welcome everybody. Welcome people who are here at the moment. Welcome folks who are watching this on a video at a later date. My name's Jana Ludwig, and Bucket asked me to come in and do a consensus training with you. And so my background for that is that I have, for about 35 years, I've been in residential intentional communities and nonprofit organizations and worker-owned co-ops and other kinds of community-based organizations, and have been part of making decisions in many different ways, but consensus has been the primary one, especially for the last 20 years of that time. And I have some formal training in consensus with some elders in the communities movement, but also just a lot of on the ground experience, including having the opportunity a few times to actually design decision-making systems kind of from the ground up. And so the things that we're going to be talking about are not just about that moment when a decision gets made, but actually the context around decision making that makes consensus work better. So this is basically, a 90-minute, which is kind of a short uh, brain dump for me about what kinds of things actually work well and don't work so well in my experience. And so I'm going to go ahead and put this into share mode, and I'm assuming someone will squawk if that's not working. You should be seeing an opening slide here that says consensus up at the top. So yeah, so we're here to do a consensus workshop. And I'm not going to read through this, but for folks that are interested in actually seeing an agenda at the beginning, we're going to be first starting out with just kind of a quick definition of what I mean by consensus and also what consensus isn't. There's sometimes some confusion about that. And then there's 6 chunks of content that I want to give you tonight. And because we only have 90 minutes, and because my understanding is that we're going to have a relatively small group of folks tonight and there's a much bigger group of people who are potentially interested in this topic and certainly ought to be consulted if any kinds of shifts are going to happen about how we're doing things. The way that I've got this structured is I'm going to give you as much content as I can in the next 90 minutes. And at the end of each one of those 6 chunks, I'm going to recommend a conversation for you to be able to have with that larger group of people, and also to kind of digest the material and get a chance to talk about it together. And then take just a few questions. If people have clarifying questions about what I'm saying, or what something that I said means, then we'll do that pause at the end of each one of these chunks. So that's the cooperative culture, values, inclusivity, agendas, blocks, and sequencing. So each one of those sections will have a recommended conversation and then a little bit of time for Q&A. And again, I want to focus that Q&A on just like our folks getting what I'm saying. It's not that important to me, like what you do. Well, I would love it if you would do something with this afterward, but it's really up to you all to have the debates about what makes sense to you about what I'm presenting. So that's my job, is to just give you the food for thought, give you some frameworks to work with, and then you all can decide what to do with it. And so we're not going to try to figure out what to do with that together tonight. That's going to be work for a later conversation that you all are going to have. So that's what I've got queued up for today. So the first thing is just a quick definition of what I mean by consensus. So consensus takes a lot of forms. There's sometimes referred to as like traditional consensus, there's activist versions, there's indigenous versions, there's Quaker versions. There's a thing floating out around there that you've probably heard of called sociocracy or dynamic governance. All of that stuff fits under what I think of the umbrella of consensus. So the core things is that everybody's taken into account and their input is listened to. So notice it doesn't say everybody is agreed with, but your input is listened to and taken seriously. And I think what that obligates us to is to try to understand each other, But also, what we're really shooting for is to find what's the best solution for the group and maybe for the project as a whole at this time. And so, passing a proposal basically means that we agree that we did our best work to come up with what we think is the best solution at this time. There's also a concept that, and this framing comes out of the Quaker tradition, that everyone has a piece of the truth. And the way that I translate that is what I refer to a little bit saucily as the speak up and shut up principle. So basically, to have consensus work really well, everybody needs to be able to put into the circle, this is what my piece is. And then most of our time is spent listening to other people and to what their pieces of the truth are. And sometimes I think of it as being like it's kind of like a pizza where there's a bunch of different slices. And typically I know what my slice is, and I might know what the slices of truth are that are right adjacent to me, but I don't necessarily know what the situation looks like to people who are in a really different place than I am. And so what we're looking for is that we get a full iteration of what the truth is on this particular topic. But that requires us to actually listen to other people and be influenced by what other people are saying and what their truth is. The other two things that are really important are that consensus should be referencing the mission and purpose of the group. So you are here to do a particular thing and to be a particular thing for the other people that are involved. That's the group's purpose. You're probably part of multiple different groups that have different purposes to them. And so what we want to be doing is making decisions that are about what's actually important for this group and what is this group supposed to be doing, and let's find the answers, the solutions that actually fit with that purpose. So not every need is going to be met in every group that we are part of or in every conversation that we're part of. And finally, we make decisions while tending to our relationships. So there's a thing that people say about consensus sometimes that like consensus takes forever. And it is definitely true that consensus takes more time than somebody floating a proposal and talking about it for a couple minutes and then taking a vote on it. And part of why it takes longer is that we're not just making decisions, we're also ideally building relationship with each other. So we are working on understanding each other. Like if I just have to take a vote on something, like I don't necessarily have to understand your perspective. I don't have to grapple with your truth. I can just have my truth and vote based on my truth. And that's a deeply non-relational way to be moving through the world. And so consensus ideally is also pushing us to tend to our relationships, to really practice our skills of listening to each other and being influenced by each other. So what consensus isn't, so it isn't a setup where you're going to be happy all the time. So there are probably times where you're going to walk away from decisions and you're not going to be happy about what happened. And the way that I think about this is that consensus and the communities that use consensus, these are LTRs, they're long-term relationships. And like any long-term relationship, you're going to have times where you're not totally happy about what's happening, but your commitment to the relationship and to the organization, to the group, to that group's mission is actually going to trump for a few minutes what it is that you personally thought that you wanted. It's also not a situation where we agree 100% all the time. So I get really irritated when I hear people describe consensus as everybody agrees on everything. It's like that is not what's happening with a healthy consensus process. In fact, if you do this process well, you're going to be more aware of genuine differences that you have with people and the places that you do disagree. So again, what we're doing is we're striving for what is the best solution for this group at this time. And that's not necessarily territory where all of your personal opinions are going to be agreed with. Consensus also doesn't solve negative power dynamics. It can be one piece of that in a healthy organization, but by itself, it doesn't actually totally flatten out power or make it so that people aren't doing weird power things. So sometimes people go into consensus with these kind of rose-colored glasses where Things are going to be totally egalitarian, where I'm going to get my way all the time, that kind of stuff. And so I'm attempting to debunk some of that right now, because if you put those expectations on it, you're going to be deeply disappointed. So finally, everybody is not involved with every decision. However, how your decisions are being made and by whom is consensual. So it is totally fine to do some delegation, to give some authority and some decision-making rights to a subgroup of people, as long as that decision is made by the whole group. So it's still consensus even in a state of delegation. Okay, so that's what I mean. So as you can see, there's lots of different ways. We're not talking about mechanics. I'll get into a little bit of mechanics in a little bit. But there's a lot of different ways of doing decision making that could fit within the sort of box that I'm drawing with these two first slides. Okay, which brings us to 6 things that I want to share with you tonight about keys to making consensus work. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the culture that you're creating around it. And then we're going to go into these other pieces. I'm mostly putting this slide in just as a reference for later when you're coming back and looking at this, or when other people are looking at this at a later date. So let's dive into culture. So this is the first piece, and we start here because I think that this is the most critical thing to get right. So a lot of people, this is a bias on my part. It's a very educated bias, but it is definitely a bias. There are people out there that think if you have the right mechanics in place, like it doesn't matter what your culture is, that those mechanics are going to still get you to good decisions. And in my experience, that's not actually true. If you get the culture right, though, if you're really striving to be coming from a cooperative, non-competitive, non-hyper individualistic place, then the mechanics matter a lot less. So I'm going to start here and yeah, and just kind of roll on. Thank you for, I got a thumbs up from Red Dog. Thank you. Okay, so what do I mean by culture? What are we talking about here? So when I was first teaching, I used to get this question almost every time I talked about anything, whether it was community or consensus or facilitation. And it's really the same question framed 2 different ways. So some people would, put their hand up and they would say like, well, I don't know, weren't we just really competitive animals? And like, it's kind of uphill to be doing this cooperative thing. And then other people would come from it sort of from the other stance, which is like, well, we're just naturally social creatures, right? And really, it's the same question, which is like, what is human nature? And the answer to this question, to both of these questions, is yes. We are competitive animals and we are social creatures. So, in terms of human evolution, we went through a period of time that I sometimes refer to as lizard brain, where it was very much every animal for themselves. And survival was very individualistic and very competitive. And that part is still in our brains. And then later on in human evolution, we went through a shift where we started banding together, we started doing things socially, and being sort of organized into groups of people. And at that point, our brains shifted. We started having language and communication that was a lot more sophisticated. And that part of our brain is still there too. So, one of the challenges of being a good balanced human is to figure out how to balance out these two sides of our brains. And we can't really get away from that basic reality. And every culture in the world cranks up the volume on one side or the other of this. So, we have cultures that are very communal in their orientation, and we have cultures that are very individualistic. So, we are in the United States, the most individualistic culture in the world. So this is based on research by this dude named Hofstede. There's a thing called the Hofstede indexes or indices. And the United States barely nudges out Australia to be the most individualistic culture in the world. So our challenge as folks who were raised in the US, if you were, is that we were taught from a very young age to be very competitive and individualistic. And so when we try to do things that are cooperative, that training kind of rears its ugly head. So why is this important? Why is this relevant to this? I think that collaborative decision making requires us to check some of that individualism at the door and kind of become a different kind of human. And I also think that consensus in particular really needs a cultural North Star to work well. So this book, The Cooperative Culture Handbook, I sent you all a little excerpt out of this ahead of time so you can kind of get a sense for what that book is like. But this was Karen Gibnig's and my attempt to sort of pull all of this together and do a really thorough articulation of what that North Star can look like. And it's really important because our culture is terrible at teaching cooperation and conflict resolution and decision-making skills, most apropos for tonight. So I think we're in a big cultural transition right now. We're getting a lot of backlash right now culturally in the United States, where that competitive and individualistic stuff is trying to sort of reassert itself. But that reassertion has actually been happening on a smaller scale in all of our organizations ever since we started trying to be cooperative, I think. And I think that's really sucks because I think most of us are longing for something that is more cooperative and is more about interdependence. And I think, that is driven kind of by a sense of mission and public good rather than just being out for ourselves. And so part of why I like to put this section at the beginning of the consensus training is that I think bringing some awareness to that cultural framework helps us be able to deliberately cultivate it. And this is also lifelong work. I've been doing this stuff for a lot of years. I literally co-wrote the book on this stuff, and I still find myself defaulting regularly into that kind of individualism and competitive stuff. So this isn't like fast work, but I think it's really important work. And I think the Rainbow Family is a place where you actually have the opportunity to do some really good work around this. Okay, so I shared with you, I'm gonna pop it out of here for a second. Um, so I don't know if this looks familiar or not, but I had shared a reading that had like a couple sections out of the Cooperative Culture Handbook with you. And so the way that this thing is structured is that each one of these sections is broken into a description of mainstream, of an aspect of mainstream culture, and then the counterculture response to that or reaction to that, and then cooperative culture and sort of what our recommendations are in one of those slices. And so the book actually has 26 of those slices in it. And so there's a chart that goes through line by line a whole bunch of like three-part descriptions. The two that I had sent to you ahead of time are the ones that are down at the bottom of this first page, consensus with healthy boundaries and hierarchy light. And I've outlined in orange on this for your future reference because this is going to relate to the conversation I'm going to recommend you have together. The ones that I think are the most potent and important to kind of wrap your heads around for healthy consensus process. And so there's a batch of them there. There's a few of them on the second page. Most of them are actually on the first page. And the conversation that I'm going to recommend that you do is to spend some time looking at the chart, and so passing it out to everybody, and then talking about ways that you've seen the left column, the mainstream culture, get in the way of doing the things that we want to be doing. So one really good example of this that I think most people can relate to is perfectionism is something that's bitten a lot of us in the ass over the years, where you just get frozen because you're trying to do everything perfectly. And then over on the counterculture side, there's a kind of anything goes attitude where it's like there's almost no standards in some ways about like yeah, like we accept everything, everything's fine. And that's different than doing the work that I think consensus is asking us to do, which is getting to a place of saying, like, okay, this is good enough for now. It doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be permanent. It's good enough for now, and it's good enough. It's not just one of the random ideas that we had about something, but it's the one that we think is the best thing for this moment. So, cooperative culture, ultimately, like this is kind of the most important four pairs of things that I think we're working on balancing. Like in some ways, I'll go back up here for a second. In some ways, the mainstream culture one is, this is still the predominant culture in the United States, is what's described in this left-hand column. And then counterculture is sort of, a lot of us have a lot of damage from that mainstream culture, a lot of pain points. And we move into counterculture, I think, to try to heal from that and to try to do things better and do things differently, and do things in a more caring way. And sometimes we take it too far and we move into martyring ourselves and codependence and not really having boundaries. And then that cooperative culture, that center one, is really looking for like what is the healthiest expression of culture that we can come up with. And so these four pairs are sort of balancing out those two sides. So it's facts and feelings. So facts matter, data matters, but so do our feelings, and so does our subjective experiences of the world. So action is really important, but so is relationships. Individualism and collectivism, again, that's the two parts of our brain. Like those are actually both really important parts of ourselves and parts of our communities. And then finally, discernment. So discernment's different than judgment. Discernment is really related to what is the best thing for this moment. So it's that good enough for now is a discernment piece, but also not losing our compassion. So it's not moving into a place of like judgment where we're making people bad, we're trying to make people feel wrong in some way. It's really not about right or wrong. It's about what is most aligned and doing that from a place that has a lot of compassion to it. So consensus is a practice ground for culture change. It's going to require us to have some discernment about what's the right thing for this group, and also the ability to reference something that is larger than your own self-interest, which is ideally the group's purpose and values. Okay, so coming here to the end of section number one on culture. So that was a very speed intro to, I have a 6-hour workshop on cooperative culture that we just did the like, I don't know, 15-minute version of. So that was a very quick intro. But I'm going to encourage you to go deeper with this. And here's the recommended discussion is to, again, look at the chart and talk about ways that you've experienced competitive and individualistic culture getting in the way of your goals, and what ways you've experienced counterculture getting in the way of your goals. And then finally, how would cultivating cooperative culture, that thing that's described in that middle column, be beneficial to you personally, maybe, but also to your community building efforts. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. This is the first pause point. Does anyone have clarifying questions about anything I've said so far? Do you want me to go back and say a little bit more? Nope. Okay. Awesome. All right, so I'm going to move on. Okay, so the second key to making consensus work is having articulated shared values. I said a minute ago that counterculture has a tendency to not be great at boundaries, and consensus really functions well when you have some healthy boundaries around your time together. So knowing what your shared values are is going to help you know things like, what is this group's work? What should we be talking about? What are the things that actually feed into those values or feed into the mission that we have together, the purpose for why we've come together as a group? So your values and mission, that's kind of operating at the highest level, helps you figure out what's in alignment, helps you attract the people into your organization that are aligned with that. If we know what the collective values are, then it's easy to bring people in and to know that those folks are going to be aligned and aren't going to be fighting with your core purposes as an organization. And then those things together feed into being able to make agreements with each other. That's what, consensus is sort of building on values and mission and alignment. And then this is the agreement making part. It also helps you course correct because it gives you a framework to be able to understand, like if we're looking at what we've been doing, how do you know if you're doing it well if you don't know what it is that you're trying to do? And so values and mission are really important for each of these different pieces, and they sort of stack on top of each other. There is a little bit of a linear relationship with them, but really all of these ultimately go back to being clear about what your values and mission are. Okay, there's also a big difference between low alignment environments and high alignment environments. And again, it's really hard to know whether you're in a low or high alignment environment without knowing what your mission and interests are. Basically, low alignment environments are one where there's the group mission and the individual missions and interests, and there's not a lot of overlap between those things. That's not going to work. Sorry, I just tried to stop a cough drop in my mouth because I'm feeling a little bit scratchy and then realized I can't talk with a cough drop in my mouth. So low alignment environments versus high alignment environments. And so high alignment is where there's a ton of overlap between group mission and interests and individuals' mission and interest. So high alignment basically means that you're operating from those shared values, but you're also developing some agreement on how that mission is fulfilled. So whatever the work is that you're trying to do together, there's a why in there that is also really important. It's not just what we're doing, but it's also why we're doing it and how we're doing it. So it also means nurturing people's participation so that their input is really valued. So we're going to talk more about that, about how to set up a decision-making process and environment where people feel like their input is really valued. And that's going to help people lean more into a sense of alignment with the group. It also means spending time in your community meetings, trainings, on the right stuff so that you're progressing toward the world that you want. So when you're not clear about what your values and mission are, you don't have a way to be clear about whether you're talking about the right stuff. And sometimes we just let people talk about whatever they want to talk about in our meetings. And, that's fine in a social group where it's like we're just hanging out together and shooting the shit as friends. It's not actually great, though, if what you're trying to do is make decisions and move something together, move some mission forward. And then finally, high alignment also means feeling like you're an important part of something bigger than you. My guess is you're good at this last piece, that, the Rainbow Family's got a highly committed group of people who have been involved for a very long time. And I think that comes out of that feeling that you're an important part of something bigger than you. So that one I feel like you probably don't even need me to say, but there I said it anyway. Okay, so creating a high alignment environment is the best way that I know to have smooth and easy decision making, and also have people be internally motivated to follow agreements. So again, if we are in an environment that looks like this, where there's a lot of overlap between my values, my mission, my interests, and the group's interest, and we're doing a job of making decisions in alignment with those values and with that mission, then I'm way more likely to be on board with it in a way where I don't have to make myself show up to implement those things. I don't have to make myself follow guidelines that we've come up with. I do it because those guidelines and those agreements are also aligned for me personally. And so it's going to be very easy for me to be supportive of those things and to follow what the group has said we want to do. Okay, so on the other hand, if you're in an inherently low alignment environment, and I don't actually have a sense of where you all fall on this scale, that would be another interesting conversation. But if for some reason you decide that you're actually a low alignment environment, meaning basically that you're designed to meet very limited needs and interests, then articulated values and really clear agendas and facilitation, which we're going to talk about in a minute, they become even more important to keep things focused because you really could be having a situation where people are wanting to bring in all kinds of things from all different angles. And that gets very frustrating, I think, for people who do want to keep things moving along, because it's like, why the hell are we even talking about some of this stuff is one of the feelings that I think happens for people a lot. And people will stop coming to meetings if they are having that feeling regularly. Okay, so this is a personal contemplation. This isn't the group conversation that I'm recommending. But what I want to encourage everybody in the group who's part of the decision-making body is to spend some time personally contemplating, like, what are you seeking to get from this group? What do you personally get out of being part of this organization? And secondly, are those needs that seem to be encompassed by the values and purposes that we've just described? So just described as in you have a shared set of values that are articulated. So this is something that I encourage everybody individually to do, and that's different than the group conversation that I want you to have. So I do want to make one more point, and I'll give you what that conversation is and pause for questions. So this need for having real alignment between personal and group values is why some kind of process, whether that's a membership selection process, which I don't think that's the kind of organization you are, but either that or some other mutual consent process to be part of decision making is really critical for having functional consensus process. So if you have to have some way of making sure that there's at least some baseline alignment between the purpose of the organization and the people that are there. If you don't, um, things get really messy really fast and really difficult and challenging. So one of the spaces that I have had the opportunity to work in a bit was the Occupy movement space. And this was a really big problem in Occupy spaces is that anybody could show up on any given night and they were fully empowered to be part of the consensus decision-making process. There was no screening at all. There was no requirement that people even understand what consensus process was. It's just if you showed up, you got tossed in and you were able to just start fully participating. And it made it really difficult after the initial surge of energy that sort of was its own aligning force. It made it really difficult for a lot of those groups to make decisions and to keep the alignment up because alignment wasn't a requirement in order to be there. And so I really encourage there being like some sort of mutual consent to be part of decision making. Okay, so here's the recommended discussion. So what are your aligning values? What are those values? And then thinking through like what obligations to our members do they suggest? So it's a two-way street. It's like you are giving something to you as an individual, are contributing something to the organization, and the organization is there to meet certain needs that your members have or your participants have. Participants might be a better word in this case. Um, and then how do we share them with new people coming in? So we're going to talk in just a minute about orienting folks. And finally, are they usable for decision making? What I mean by this is that sometimes values are so open-ended that they're almost like, do you know what Warsash blots are? Those things in like psychological testing that are black and white ink blots. And the whole point is that you project whatever you want to project onto them. So sometimes value statements are so vague that they function like Warsash blots and they feel good. They sound like we're in alignment with each other, but you're actually not because everybody's projecting something really different on them. And so getting enough specificity in your value statements and mission statement so that it's a useful guide during decision-making processes is sort of the second level, the sort of advanced level of values alignment for organizations. Okay, pausing to see if there are questions. Not in so far. I don't know if this is a good sign or a bad sign. I'm just going to keep rolling though. Okay. All right, keeping rolling. Okay. So I've talked about this a little bit, but the third key is educated and inclusive participation. So what I mean by this is, describing a minute ago what was happening in Occupy, that there was really no education happening in most of the chapters, or at least the ones that I was brought in to help with, about like how decision making works. There was like a very brief, like maybe 1 to 2 minute explanation, but there wasn't really enough education happening for people to be able to actually understand it and to understand what their responsibility was to the group. So also making sure that once you're clear about what your shared values are, that people understand what they mean. And that means that people know how to participate and also how to participate well. So inclusive participation means creating structure and processes that genuinely value a diversity of people and perspectives. So that is the next little bite we're going to take here. Okay, so orientation and education lead to genuine inclusion and power. So we're bringing people into the circle deliberately, so it's not just whoever shows up on a call or whoever shows up in the space, but we're, for the purposes of decision making, we're actually being a little more deliberate than that. So people know when they become part of the decision-making body. So it should be clear, am I part of that or am I just an observer at this point? And also should be clear about the responsibility that that carries. I'll talk more about the responsibility in a little bit. So people are entrusted with decision-making power once they have that basic orientation and training. And that word is really deliberate. We are entrusting each other. We are trusting each other to be able to show up well. And then finally, people are able to influence the process once they're a regular participant. So this is also really important that, that we, processes change over time. That's natural, that's healthy, that's a good thing. And people should be able to not just influence decisions that are happening, but also influence the process that you're using once you've been doing it for a while. So getting the right people in the room, and I have in the room in quotes because I don't know if you do things by Zoom or do things in person. I don't know if you meet outside or inside. So in the room is metaphorical in this case. So there's the macro level of the thing that I was just talking about, like who is in your group and why. But there's also the micro level when you're doing agenda setting, when you're deciding what you're going to talk about, and when you're gathering input from folks, you're making sure that you're deliberately including the people who are most impacted by those decisions. So that could be anything. I mean, this varies a lot. Sometimes it's low income folks who are in your group. Sometimes it's parents of young children or people with disabilities. Sometimes it's event creators or event participants. One way or another, there's like making sure that those people who really need to be in the conversation and need to have some influence over this because it affects their lives are being able to participate. So alignment is great, and without inclusion, it's not very robust or resilient. And what I mean by that is that when we have an aligned group of people and it's the right people to be in that conversation, those are going to be better decisions. It's going to be a stronger organization coming out of your decision-making process when those two things are paired together. Okay. There's also a lot of dynamics around power. I'm sure we're all familiar with power dynamics in the various organizations that we've been part of. And this is probably review for most of you who are watching this, but I want to draw a distinction between power over and power with. And so power over is unidirectional. So it sort of comes from above and imposes itself on other people. So in our formal decision-making processes, this isn't supposed to be happening, right? Like we're not trying to have a person or a small group of people impose something. But in reality, it's not unusual to have people who are coming from that competitive, individualistic approach to things act in power over kinds of ways. And what tends to happen is that over time, a handful of individuals collect a lot of power, and then they don't actually have to listen to other people. They don't have to take other people into account, and they can act in ways that are really self-serving. So power with is very different than that. So power with is mutually empowering, and it's based on staying really closely connected to what real needs are and what the interests of other people are. And you often will see organizations that are coming from more of a power with place. You'll see that power moves pretty easily between people. It doesn't pool in a handful of people. There's actually many people who are exercising power, and sometimes that changes who's exercising the most power. And it's ideally done really deliberately so that those people are the people who are most affected or are the people who are most knowledgeable or most skilled about whatever it is that we're talking about. And power with ultimately serves a collective instead of just an individual or a small group of people. So some keys for coming from power with are thoughtful planning and coordination. So it's really hard for a lot of people to really fully participate when they don't know what the conversations are going to be. I'll say more about that soon. So this includes doing relevant work. So again, if you're clear what your organization is about, what you're supposed to be doing here, you can be clear about what the relevant work is for you to be talking about. You can also be really deliberate about accounting for ability to participate. So sometimes that means doing something via Zoom. Sometimes it means doing something in person. It means paying attention to when people can come to things. It means paying attention to disability needs that people have. And then point C here is having clear expectations. Like, what are we trying to do in this session so that people know what to expect? When there aren't clear expectations, there's a lot of default power over that can sneak into the space where people who have more power are comfortable wielding power can sort of push things in a particular direction. And if the whole group wasn't clear about what we were supposed to be doing, they can get away with it a lot more than if we have clear expectations, and then it's much easier to interrupt power overplays. Power with is also fostered by having good conflict resolution. This is, I think, the only thing I'm going to say about this tonight, but having some kind of conflict resolution structure and system in place is really important. That's a whole other workshop, so we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. But I'm just going to name it because I would be remiss to not actually say this at some point tonight. And then finally, talking when things don't go as planned. So that means being able to do evaluations of what are we doing and is it actually serving us? There's also a really important role for record keeping. So I know some groups are great about record keeping. I don't know what your status is, but this is something that I influence with, or that I mention with just about every group that I talk to. Because we tend to be either really bad, either record keeping is non-existent or not writing anything down, or it's very sparse. Things get written down occasionally when somebody feels motivated or moved to do it, or there's not good kind of protocols in place for what kinds of decisions get record kept and what kinds of things go into that record. For instance, are you talking at all about the why, or are you just talking about what was decided? Those are different kinds of record keeping. So relying on people's memories is really chancy. And this is, I don't think there has to be anything nefarious assigned here to be able to make that statement. What was important to me about a conversation is probably different from what was important to Bucket or to Red Dog about that conversation. And we're going to remember and we're going to focus in our memories on the things that were important to us. And that means that we have different memories of what just happened. So poor record keeping also means that new people don't really have a way to get in and to understand your culture, your protocols. There's no like reliable institutional memory there for people to be able to draw on. And finally, I have no idea what the legal status is of your organization, but sometimes there's legal requirements for record keeping, and if you're not following those, particularly in an environment that is sort of increasingly hostile to things that are not super conservative, really make sure that you're doing whatever legal requirements there are with record keeping so that you don't get yourselves into trouble with that. Okay, so what I recommend for this is having a searchable online decision log of some kind. Most groups can get away with just having like a Google Doc that it's not where all of your minutes are stored if you take minutes, but it is where just the decisions are stored. And reasons why I recommend this is that it's a really easy shared repository that anybody, even somebody who's having insomnia and is trying to remember something, they can go in at 3 o'clock in the morning and they can find the thing. Again, people don't often remember details of decisions, and if you're making decisions that are needing some kind of implementation to happen, having the details of that decision is going to be really important, or you're just going to end up fighting with each other when you get to the implementation phase. It also heads off future conflict based on differing memories. It makes replacing people in particular roles and passing on knowledge much easier. And it provides a tool to help for coordinated efforts between teams. If you have different groups of people that are doing different parts of things, having good record keeping makes it easier for them to do their jobs well. So there's a little bit of guidance on here. I'm not going to read all the way through it. That if you decide you want to start doing record keeping differently or to use this if you don't already. If you do already, then I hope I'm just affirming what you're already doing. If you don't, though, there's a little more guidance here on the slide. Okay, so recommended discussion. So who's included in the way that we currently do meetings and who's excluded? So, again, that goes back to like, how are we structuring things? Are we including anybody? And what does that mean? Like, what's the impact of that? So our choices related to how we do our meetings impact who's able to participate. And one of the things that's really good to do every once in a while is to step back, particularly if you've been around for a long time, and to ask this question about what the implications are of your current decision-making process in terms of who is able to participate. Okay, questions? That was the end of the section.
Hi, Yana.
Hi.
First of all, this is awesome. Everything you're saying is like very, very apt to the kinds of questions we have. That's kind of why maybe there's fewer questions, but just to help, I'm sure Bucket's talked to you a little bit, but our our non-organization of Rainbow Family is way more like Occupy, where anybody, and it's really radical inclusion for the council process, because literally anyone can walk up at any time and be part of that process, even if they are at a low level of education. So just to guide your understanding, it's more like that.
Mhm.
Uh, and in terms of the legal aspect of it, there is no legal entity. We are all individuals which kind of makes it
Okay.
very unique.
hmm Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that
Yep,
clarity.
thank.
Yeah. So, and is this, are you mostly doing decision making in person at gatherings? Is that what it is? Or how
Yes,
does,
on the land is kind of
Mhm,
although there are a lot of things that happen uh, on Zoom with a subgroup of people, or maybe on chats, any real kind of decision making would be have to be on the land in person in a circle, where
mhm, mhm,
you pass a talking stick around or a feather
mhm,
or whatever.
Okay. Yeah, and so, and are there binding decisions getting made in any of those spaces?
Um, I don't want to dominate anybody's answers here, but can you repeat your question there?
Yeah, are there binding decisions getting made? Like decisions that actually people are expected to follow?
Okay, well, I mean, interestingly enough, when you, I think, and I'm speaking from my own understanding of it, if you're in a circle that has a consensus, really you're only bound to that consensus of the people who are in that circle. However, there is a longstanding tradition of the Rainbow Family listening to what a council will say. For example, the big one, the Vision Council, where the gathering is going to be next year, uh, people usually go with what that council decides.
hmm
It's so is it are people bound to it? No, by no means is anybody bound to anything. It's kind of
hmm
more you could call it advisory.
Okay. All right. Great. Thanks. Bucket and Red Dog, you also unmuted, so I didn't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Um, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's kind of what you said. It's the decision that we're making in council is only binding by those that are there. But like, kind of how you were saying earlier, the greater Rainbow family has entrusted those of us that have chosen to come to this circle to make the decision, and
hmm
then will follow that decision that was made in that circle.
Okay. Okay, great. Ooh, my lights just flickered. Am I frozen?
You're still here.
Okay, good. Great. Whew. Okay. That would suck if we cut out. Okay, well, let me go ahead and get through the rest of the presentation stuff, which some of which is going to make sense for you and some of which isn't. I'm going to give you my recommendations, and then I think we'll have some time to talk about this at the tail end before we're done. So, okay, great. Thank you for the additional background. I appreciate it. Uh, okay, so clear agenda and facilitation. So this definitely can apply even if you're in the circle on the land and anybody is able to come in and be part of it, which is I really recommend that you have facilitators who are what I'm going to call outcome neutral, meaning that they are not pushing for a particular outcome. They are just here to hold the space to be fair and inclusive. And secondly, having clear agendas. So I think these are essential for using our time well. Um, I know that sometimes, like with Occupy, I don't know if this is true for you as well, but like sometimes it would turn into 7 hour long meetings and that wouldn't necessarily go anywhere that was all that helpful for people. It was just really exhausting for people to be able to participate. And that also meant that also shut people out from being like if you couldn't afford to spend until midnight every night in these lengthy conversations, you weren't able to actually be part of it. And that eliminated a whole bunch of people from particular subgroups. So the other thing that agendas do is that they allow people to have time to actually develop their thinking. If you don't know what the agenda is, if you don't know what's going to be talked about, there are some people who think very quickly on their feet. They can totally roll with that. They're comfortable thinking out loud. They're comfortable doing that in public in a pretty big group of people. And there are some people that really aren't, that like need to sleep on things, need to be able to like think about it ahead of time and who can't like think and listen simultaneously, which is actually all of us. Nobody can actually think and listen at the same time. And there's some people who are better at managing that than other people. And so you lose all those people who aren't very good at managing that. So this is the key question. When I teach facilitators, this is the question that we come back to every week of that training. So here's the key thing, like every decision we make privileges someone or someone's. When meetings happen, where they happen, how you conduct conversations. So if you're always doing a talking stick in a big circle, that's going to work great for some people. It is not going to work great for some other people. And so if you only do that version of conversation, those are the people that are always going to do well with that. So any given choice, this is actually kind of a fairly neutral statement. Some people are going to feel comfortable. Some people are going to be able to give their best thinking and input. They'll shine, they'll be relaxed, and some people won't. And they're going to shut down and they're not really going to be able to participate well or at all. So, and I will say more about that. We're going to loop back to that in a few minutes, but I want to say a little bit about clear agendas. So productive meetings, forward-moving meetings really require some pre-planning. And this is where your facilitators come in, having somebody who is thinking about, okay, so we're chewing on this thing, we're working on this thing. What would be the best way to have that conversation? And that takes some real thought and it takes some skill and it takes time to be able to do that. So having clear agendas ahead of time allows there to be some pre-planning. And again, most people need some time to digest what's going to be discussed. And if there's any background information to it, they need to be able to get some of the background information ahead of time. Now, obviously, if you're doing a meeting one day and then you're coming back to that same topic the next day, that's going to help with that if you're not expected to just sort of push through the whole thing in one session. And also people are busy, and knowing ahead of time what's going to be talked about allows them to know whether this is a topic that they actually want to be part of. So just being part of the interest, and I appreciate Red Dog you saying that it's like people have been entrusting whoever is going to show up with that power. And some people are going to be more invested in some conversations than others, and and are ideally going to be at choice about whether they want to be part of that particular conversation. And that's a consent issue. So I think when you don't have agendas prepared ahead of time, it's really hard for people to be able to be truly at consent to be part of that conversation, either as a witness or a participant. And so they foster not only consent, but also really careful thinking and just thoughtfulness in general. So I love this quote. There's a great blog post called "Robert's Rules Suck" by Marty Wilder, and this is one of the things that Marty says in that post. I don't want to presume to bring a solution that will address everyone's needs. I want to hear from others, and I want my thoughts to be affected by those stories. I want our collective ideas to become as we meet. My guess is the intention behind the format that you've chosen is wanting this to be able to play out. And it's hard to control the pace of things and hard to like actually let something, let us stay focused on one thread of conversation long enough when the feather's getting passed and people are being able to like just speak to whatever they want to speak to. One of the things that facilitators can do is they can help you stay with a particular thread of the conversation long enough that something can emerge in a good way that actually makes sense to people, like how we got from here to here. There's also this piece, either we're going to do the thing that I'm bringing, like a lot of people come in with ideas of something they want us to do, and what's a really healthy consensus attitude around that is like, well, either we're going to do this cool thing that I'm thinking of, or we're going to do something even better because other people's ideas are actually additive to mine. They're not taking something away. If they're different ideas, they're actually adding to the thing that I brought and the thing that I'm excited about. Okay, so facilitators hold the space for that curiosity and for cooperation to actually flourish, and making sure that we're hearing from people, and that's actually a main driver for people ultimately buying in to well-developed proposals. So without deliberate planning, it's really hard to create the kind of environment that this kind of environment that I'm describing. And so I think that you need facilitators to do this well. I don't know if you have facilitators or not, but I'm making a pitch for make sure you have facilitators who are outcome neutral and have some time to do some planning and some understanding of how to facilitate and how to hold space for people to have really good listening with each other. Okay, so some quick guidance on agenda planning. First of all, is this what we should be talking about in this group? Is the topic ready for a conversation? Sometimes someone will want to talk about something, but it's like, well, we actually need some background, or we need to make sure a couple other people are in the room in order to have a productive conversation about that. Being clear about who's facilitating and making sure that we've given them some time to prepare. Thinking about like what kinds of input do we need to gather and how are we gathering it? I'm going to talk about meeting formats here in a minute. There's a lot of different ways to do meetings. You've got one way that you've been doing. I want to make a pitch for mixing that up. So is the meeting or agenda item, what is it for? Is it input gathering? Is it processing, bonding, decision making? Those are really different kinds of meetings. And no format works well for all of those different kinds of meetings. So thinking about what formats do that most effectively, whatever that goal is. And how do we know when we're done? This was another challenge with the Occupy stuff, is that sometimes the juice ran out of a topic long before people stopped talking. And that ends up dragging on and actually creates a lot of exhaustion for people who are committed to continuing to show up in the process. Okay, so varying formats is essential. This may be the most challenging thing that I'm going to say in terms of how you've been doing stuff, but varying formats is really important for having an inclusive process, and for sustaining participation over time. So different formats evoke different kinds of input. They work well for different kinds of brains, and they reduce monotony and boredom in meetings. Like if meetings always feel the same and look the same, like a significant chunk of people are going to get bored and are not going to continue to show up and participate in that. You'll end up with a group of people who love that format, and you'll end up with not a lot of people who are like, of your total pool of people who could be showing up, who are really consistently committed to being there. Okay, so here's 10 formats. I'll walk quickly through this because you may not have questions, but people who are listening to this might have questions. So the first one is open discussion. This can be done with a talking stick, or not, where it's just we're all in one big group and we're talking, and that's what the format is. And then there's small groups and pairs work. So breaking up into smaller groups to have sub conversations that may feed back in, or small groups can be used to go off and do a chunk of work on behalf of the bigger group to prepare a proposal or chew on the details of a certain aspect of the proposal. There's also brainstorms. I think probably everybody's familiar with brainstorms, so I'm not going to say much about that. There's go-arounds, and I don't know if that's how you're actually doing your feather passing, if it's just going around in a circle. There's also a thing called spiraled rounds, which are like a go-around, but where on the first round, everybody speaks or has the option of speaking. On the second round, what you're looking for is, does anybody have anything new to add? And then you do another smaller round with people who have something new to add. And then third round, does anyone have anything new to add? So you're avoiding repeating with this, and it's getting smaller over time. So the first circle is bigger and then it gets smaller and smaller, which is why it's called a spiraled round. This is really great to do, if you limit everybody on the first round to only adding one item or one piece of input, what ends up being sort of headed off is that person who is going to speak for 10 minutes and is going to say all kinds of different things, some of which some other people in the circle are also thinking. And that person who took up a whole bunch of airtime is going to get all the creative credit for those ideas when it's not only their idea. And so it spreads out the creative credit through the rest of the group instead of that getting pooled in just one person. So card storms are a variation on brainstorms. So with brainstorms, you usually have somebody who's like, the most common way to do it is somebody's taking notes on big sheets of paper. So you do that, but you leave a little space between each one so that you can then cut the big pieces of paper up into strips that have one item per strip. And then you toss them on the floor, toss them on the ground, toss them on a table, and you tell people to organize it. And what happens with this is that the group takes ownership over how your thoughts are being organized, and it ends up being in buckets. And the facilitator doesn't have to do that work themselves, and the group has then owned it. And then you put a label on each one of those clusters of items, and the group then has ownership over that organization. Sometimes facilitators will take a bunch of information that's come out of a meeting, go and organize it, and when it comes back, people don't recognize it. So this avoids that power dynamic where the facilitator doesn't have the power to do that. The group is holding the power to do that. And it also keeps your facilitators from having to do a bunch of extra work and also getting accused of manipulating people's input in some way. So fish bowls are where there's a small conversation, a small circle of conversation happening within the bigger circle. It really helps to focus people's attention because it feeds into the part of our brains that are very trained to watch movies or watch things on a stage. And so it taps into that and uses it to help create a more focused experience for people. Silence, creative visualization, and art, these are just tools that you can use in different ways. I'm not going to go into those deets. So milling, I mean a particular format where you get a question prompt, you have people get up, find a partner, answer that question with that partner, and then find a different partner. You've got a different question, sometimes the same question, and then find another partner and you have a different question. So it gets everybody up and moving. If people are disabled and aren't able to get up and move, you can have people go to them. But it's a way of getting people in like small conversations. It also can get very loud, so you want to be careful about that from like a hearing access standpoint. And then there's spectrums, which are basically drawing an imaginary line and having one end of the line be one perspective or one trait and the other side being a different one. You can also do them online, and I'm actually giving you access to a template document. So if you're doing some of your meetings online and want to do that, you're going to have a bunch of format resources there that you can use. And that document you are welcome to use. Just make a copy of it and you can use it for your meetings. Okay, so that was a lot. So recommended discussion is, what formats do we use regularly? It sounds like you have a format that you use regularly, at least for your live sessions. And really thinking about like, who do those formats privilege? Like, who is that working well for? And then how would moving toward designated and trained facilitators benefit our process? Again, I don't know if you're doing that already or not. If you aren't, though, I'd love to encourage you to have a conversation about that. Okay, good. Moving on. Okay, cool. All right, so I've got two more sections, and this is the nuts and bolts consensus section of this. So letting people block for any reason does not work in the long run. It is deeply discouraging for everybody else, and it allows people to be operating from that individualistic competitive mindset, and it gives them power in a way that is really bad for other people who are trying to come from more of a collaborative and cooperative approach to things. So, just quickly, you're probably used to these three. You may have variations on this. Sometimes there's, 5-finger method or something. This is the sort of most classic version of this. Just going to go through these quickly. So agreement, stand-asides, and blocks. So agreement actually covers like if this is the full range, I don't know if you can see my hands or not, or if this is too little, but this is like the full range of responses you can have. Agreement actually covers most of it. So it's everything from I'm totally stoked about this, this is great, to like, I can live with it, to like, I can see how I was taken into account, not thrilled, but yeah, I think this is the best we can do. Stand-asides are heavily underused in most consensus processes. This is where you register personal objections that are not based on group held values. It could also be like, I haven't been present enough to know how I feel, or I don't know enough about this background to know how I feel, so I'm not feeling good enough about it to agree, but I also don't know enough to block, so I'm going to stand aside. And it also includes, I really don't like this, but I don't think it's harmful to this group. So you can see how you've got to be clear about what this group is here for, what the mission is, what the values are, in order to be able to make that determination about whether it's a stand aside or a block. And so blocks should only be used when you believe that it violates group held values or endangers the group, because this is using your personal power to stop the group from moving forward. So you better genuinely believe that it is a mistake for this group. And again, you don't know if it is for this group or not unless you're clear about what this group is for. So blocks and stand-asides, I think, are broadly misunderstood with most people who are practicing consensus. So it's really got to be tied to group held values. So blocking has to be an option, right? So blocking is power that the consensus process bestows on an individual. However, that's got to be balanced out by responsible usage of it. And so this is where anybody who just shows up gets to fully participate can get very problematic. So if individuals aren't aware that blocking brings with it a lot of responsibility to the group, then essentially what you're doing is you're empowering power abuse by letting somebody block. So relating functionally to block. So I think there's 3 things that you need to check for. And this is another case where, like, if you don't have a facilitator who's been entrusted with some authority, you don't have somebody who can do this. So criteria for legitimate blocks. So participation, have you been here for the conversation? And secondly, have you been making a good faith effort to hear other people? That second one is a subjective call. So who gets to make that call? I think it's one of the reasons why you need to have somebody who is in the facilitative role who can make that call. This is a very difficult thing to do as a facilitator, and I think this is one of the responsibilities of being in that role. So finally, it's in alignment with group held values and mission. So legitimizing blocks is something that most groups do not do. So this is a collective and relational discernment process that you're going to go through. So first of all, make sure the group understands the reason behind the block and how the person believes a group held value, how it's tied to a group held value. So you should just not let people block unless they're willing to say that, unless they're willing to say, I believe this is wrong for this group or is going to be damaging to this group and to our values because X, Y, and Z. And then you test their thinking. So basically what you do is you say, like, we need to get a handful of people who are willing to do what's called validating that block. So in small groups, so I have groups that I work with that are 8 or 10 people. In that size of a group, it's like one other person needs to be able to see how they got there, needs to be able to say, even if I disagree with their analysis, I can see how they are legitimately tying this to a group held value. If you're a group of 300, that might be 20 people. So you set a percentage of people or, some number based on the size of the group that legitimizes blocks. And this may sound far-fetched, but I've actually been in the role a couple times of legitimizing someone's block where I've been like, I deeply disagree with what you're saying, and I really want us to do this thing, and I get it. And so I'm going to be one of the people who's going to validate that block. So this is part of why I think you need to do some, like, people need to have some baseline training to be able to really participate in consensus because they need to know that this is possible, that if they go off the deep end and attempt to block something, that there is a way to interrupt that. And also they need to understand their obligation to really carefully participate in this part of the process. They may be asked to validate someone's block at some point, and they have to understand why and how that works. And you can't really have blocking happening in a functional way without these kind of values-based guardrails on the thing. So finally, blocks suck. They suck for everybody. The people who are doing it, I mean, unless they're just gleeful power trippers, in which case maybe it doesn't suck for them. It sucks for everybody else though. So really tending to the relationships, taking some time to like sit with what just happened. This thing just got derailed that was really important to us, and not just like checking out and everybody going to their individual corners to bitch or to feel shitty about it or whatever, but to try to really keep the circle intact and be able to tend to those relationships. Okay, I think I've said all but the last little section on this. So in terms of stand-asides, one important note as well is that if you have a stand-aside or 2 stand-asides, this isn't that big of a deal. If you have, say you have a meeting that has like 60 people at it and you have 10 stand-asides and they were for 6 different reasons, it's probably an indication that the proposal wasn't really ready to be agreed to. So it just indicates that there's like lots of kind of holes in it, and that maybe you need to like back up and do a little bit deeper consideration and find some way to meet the needs that those folks are expressing. Or maybe just slow it down. If you've got a lot of stand-asides because a whole bunch of people are saying like, I just haven't digested this, that can be a good sign to just like slow down, because ultimately your point is that you want to pass proposals that people are going to be able to get behind and really fully support and buy into and back up. Okay, so there's that. Okay, so group conversation. Is there a mechanism for blocks currently? What is the mechanism? Do people just do it and then it's over? What would a validation of blocks process look like for us? And how might we benefit from adding that to our procedures? So that's the conversation I'd encourage you to have. Really think about, is this validation thing something that you want to do? I'm going to not pause for questions because I want to get this last piece of presentation in, and 10 minutes is about what I need. But I will stay for a few minutes after the 30, whatever, it's 7:30 for me, and make some space for some more questions for folks. Okay. Okay, so key number 6 is sequencing. So conversations that are simultaneously articulating issues and trying to solve them don't actually work very well. One of my mentors used to say that it's like trying to breathe in and out simultaneously. And unless you're like a didgeridoo player, you probably can't do that. So most of us aren't capable of doing that. So I want to give you this thing that sometimes gets referred to as bubbles and boxes, or like Yana's one weird trick for consensus, about sequencing. So, okay, so these green circles, we're going to call them bubbles. So each one of these bubbles is a person's thinking on a topic. Doesn't matter if this is an official subgroup or committee, or it's just three random people who are sitting around a meal together and get excited about doing something and want to bring it to the group. Okay, so these three people have some overlapping thinking, and we're going to assume that these folks are, understand that there are other people in the world who have other thinking, and they're going to take that into account. And they're going to bring a proposal, and boxes in this case are proposals. So we have bubbles, we have three people's thinking, and then they're going to bring a proposal to the group that is represented by this box. So here's what happens when you bring a proposal to the group like this. So these other gray circles are the rest of the people in the group. There may be 60 of these, there could be a smaller number of these, doesn't really matter. It's just the sort of theory here that I'm trying to get across. So what typically happens is that these folks, certainly these three, and this person here probably are going to be kind of like, cool, let's go. I need to talk about this. Thank you for doing the work. I'm excited. Let's do it. They may not even share what their thinking is, what the content of their bubbles are. If they're trying to be good community members and not take up a lot of extra airtime, they're probably going to be pretty quiet and not share a lot. People you're going to hear from are these folks who, like, a little bit of their thinking is in the box, but not all of it. And these folks might not even really connect that they agree with some of the thinking, because where we tend to go when we feel invalidated and unseen is to talk about all the ways that we feel invalidated and unseen. So most of the meeting time is probably going to be spent on these bubbles, this portion of these bubbles, talking about what they don't like about it. And this person over here, this bubble that is not in the box at all, is going to be like, why the hell are we even talking about this? Okay, so that's going to be most of the talk time that's going to happen. These are going to present, and then these four people are going to take most of the talk time. So our well-meaning original bubble makers are going to go back to the drawing board, and they're going to create a new proposal. So they're going to alter what they were doing in some ways. And so now these two people are good. This person is going to have a really interesting reaction to this, which is like, wait, you just took out the things that I was excited about. And even some of their own thinking is getting compromised at this point. This person's going to be like, yeah, nice try. And this person over here is going to be like, I still don't understand why we're talking about this. So this meeting is not going to be very much fun for anybody. And so they might go back and try to draw another box at this point and do a third iteration of the thing. And so at this point, these three people, our original green bubble thinkers, never want to do anything for your group again. They are completely burned out on this process. They tried to do a good thing. They tried to anticipate. They brought a proposal the way that you say you want us to bring proposals in order to talk about something. Has everybody been in this meeting at some point? You're familiar with this dynamic?
Yes.
Yes, so much, so much. Okay, so here's the trick. Here's the one weird trick. Bubbles before boxes. Okay, what I mean by that is figure out what people's input is and what people are concerned about. Get a full articulation of that before you start drawing boxes, making proposals. Okay, so you'll note that there's a couple bubbles here that are not entirely inside the box. Okay, so what you can do though, and this is again another reason to have somebody who's a facilitator who's keeping track of who is saying what and what's important to them and what that content is. Your facilitators can gather the bubbles and pull it together in a nice summary so we can now go solve the right problem. But they can also do another thing, which is that they can stay in relationship with these two people whose bubbles are not entirely held by this. So maybe this person over here, like, they rarely like anything because they never want us to spend more than $600 on anything. And you can go to the person and you can say, okay, so we did the work of trying to figure out how low cost we could do this thing. It turns out we can't do it for less than $800. This person is being communicated with, they're being seen, they're being held, they're being related to, they're not just being shoved to the side in the process. And you can do that because you did a good job of gathering their input along with everybody else's input. So this is a way to stay in relationship and also make it a lot easier on us, that we're not just like drawing a box that then people argue with the box instead of talking about what's important to them. So that's essentially what this dynamic is. Okay, so this has two really distinct phases to it. And this is another reason why facilitators are a good thing, because they can help the group stay disciplined. So in the bubbles phase, I want your advocacy. I want your soapboxes. I want your high energy individualism to get expressed. And I want us to be like hearing each other's needs and interests. This is a really good time. Like, we're not having to worry about how it's going to work yet. We can just listen to each other and get to know each other. And this is the time for some compassion. This is expansive. If you're familiar with divergent and convergent models, this is the divergent phase. This is like passionate, high energy phase. There may be brainstorming involved, or it could just generally be like we're collecting people's thoughts. And then at some point, we're going to pivot out of that and we're going to move into the boxes phase. So at this point, advocacy is complete. Like, I don't want to hear your soapbox anymore. We got it. Now's the time for bridging, for bringing people's perspectives together. This is the place for collectivism to be expressed. This is creative problem solving time. It's the time for discernment about ideas and what serves the mission and maybe the immediate goals. So this is contractive and it's thoughtful. So these are two very different energies. And the good news is most people get to play in the area that they want to play at some point in this, and they get to do it really cleanly. So the people who get all excited and animated, they don't have people sitting on them and being like, that's not realistic in this, in the bubbles phase. They get to be themselves. And then the people who are your really good problem solvers, they get a phase two where they get to shine and where they get to really contribute to it. So energetically, it holds both of those kind of poles that are often competing for airtime during your discussions in a way that ends up being really, really messy. So what this looks like, to put it in linear form here, is like you're presenting the issue and then you're collecting bubbles. And basically what you're saying is, what would a good proposal need to take into account? What do we need to understand and to know in order to be solving the right set of problems? And then I recommend a second round of bubbles by different means. And so what I mean is that list of those 10 formats that I was talking about, they work well for different brains. Like, some people are going to be totally comfortable speaking in front of the whole group and giving their input in that way. Some people aren't. Some people are going to want to do it on a spectrum. Some people are going to want to do it in a small group conversation or via a survey, which wasn't on the list, but is a totally legit way to collect more input. And so you want to make sure that you're giving multiple different ways for people to get in. And then you do a last call. You assign proposal creation to someone or someone's. And their job is basically figure out how to get as many bubbles in the box as we can. And then you come back, you present it to the group, and you check it against the bubbles, and you check it against the mission. Okay, and you have some conversations with folks. If there's bubbles that can't fit in the box, we talk about why. And we stay in communication with the people whose bubbles might not fit. And that's okay, because not every proposal has to do everything for every person. This proposal is going to do what it's going to do. There may be some bubbles that end up going into a for future reference bucket where it's like, okay, we have these needs that we can't address with this proposal, but we're going to get back to figuring out how to meet those needs at a later date. Okay, so the recommended discussion here is thinking about how proposals are developed, and then whether that process allows adequate space to make sure like all the relevant input has been heard prior to moving on to proposal making. Okay. Also, brainstorm. What are the different ways that we can gather input prior to developing proposals? That's a second sort of bonus recommended conversation to be done as a brainstorm. Okay, so one closing thought, and then I'm done, and I'm only going to be 2 minutes late. Okay, so listening and empathy brings us closer together. So I'm encouraging this whole package of things that I've been presenting tonight is really about creating an environment where listening and empathy are able to be core features of how we're doing stuff with each other. We also want to be working the bugs out by anticipating challenges. So again, that bubbles phase, if you're doing it really thoroughly, part of what you're going to get is like, what are the challenges for implementing this? What am I worried about? Not just in terms of values alignment and not just in terms of what we're doing, but how we're doing it and how we're implementing. And we want to make sure that we're thinking that stuff through as much as we can before we make a decision. So one of my friends has talks about this as like how much easier it is to like erase and move a wall at the stage of like an architectural drawing than it is to like move a wall after the house is built. And so really like doing some thinking this stuff through more thoroughly is going to help you not have to move walls once the house is built. And also bringing the long-term relationship ethic of community in. So giving ground sometimes out of care for others and others doing that for you. So sometimes your bubble's not going to fit. And then if we're developing this ethic where it's like we really are caring about each other's needs, then other people are going to be holding, okay, your bubbles, we're going to make sure we get those handled in a different way. Okay, that's what I got. 2 minutes late. Darn it. Okay. All right. So that's what I have for you. Do folks have questions at this point?
That was amazing. I really like bubbles and boxes. I'm definitely an early boxer. That's one of the big problems. I box too early.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Yeah. Yeah, I'm the person the facilitators have to sit on who's like, oh, but we could, yeah, early boxer. Me too. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's the big question I think that everybody's thinking about. One of the big questions is you kept emphasizing a need for a facilitator. And I agree with you, like all the other organizations and groups I've worked with Consensus, we have a facilitator, right? The problem, the way we currently do our circles is we do not have a facilitator unless the person who has the talking stick at the moment decides to do some facilitation, and the entire circle has to trust that person to do it, and that's not always the case. And this is one of the biggest, in my opinion, one of the biggest problems with how Rainbow Family does Consensus is because we don't. And so I talked about this a lot. We know this is a problem. The question is, we can't figure out how to solve this.
Well, I think so the conversations that I'm recommending to have are kind of designed to like give you some space to be able to really think about how you're doing your group process as a whole. I personally would not participate in a process that doesn't have a facilitator and doesn't have someone holding the space for that conversation, just because I think they are typically inefficient and there's no clear check on power abuse and shitty behavior. And I don't enjoy being in conversations where somebody grabs the stick and holds forth for 20 minutes about their thing without regard to like how it's landing. So I think that facilitators are guardrails, in the same way that I think that that vision and values, mission and values are guardrails on conversations, and I think they're pretty essential. And I think you're going to have that conversation. And the ethic of good enough for now, safe enough to try, that framing comes out of the sociocracy world, and it's one of my favorite things that comes out of that world. And and it might be worth, like, can we do an experiment and facilitate things for a year and see what that feels like, and then have a conversation about, like, how was that? Was that better? Did we lose something that was really important to us? Because I think there probably are pieces of your culture that are really important, and I'd want it to be done in a way where those things don't get lost. So, but I think you're just going to have to decide as a group whether you want to change that particular practice. Yeah. Okay, other questions for me before we wrap up?
Curious, like, are you available in general for hire?
Oh,
We lost
and
it.
we completely lost him. I think they were asking about whether, oh, there you are. We lost you for a minute there. I think you were asking about whether I'm available to support this more in some way. Yes, in the future, but not for the next at least 15 months, because I'm going to be overseas in grad school on a student visa that prevents me from doing this work. This is why we hurried up to get this in now, is that I'm going to be out of the loop. I can, however, recommend people that I 100% trust, who could possibly play that role for you sooner.
Okay, I'd definitely be interested in getting that
Mhm.
information as well as your contact information if possible.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I will. So I'm going to share the slides with you, and then Bucket's going to share the recording with you. I will also give you a link to my referrals document, which is a little bit of a work in progress right now, but I'm committing to getting it done before my classes start in about a month. So I will get that fleshed out for you. Great. Well, thank you for the invitation, and yeah, and good luck with it. It's fun. It was fun to get to think about, like, supporting this world a little bit with this. So thank you for the opportunity.